The morning my mother stopped looking at me, there was no argument, no raised voice, no tears, no door slammed hard enough to shake the frame. She simply rose from where she had been sitting at the kitchen table, smoothed her apron down with both hands, the way she always did when she was composing herself, and she walked back toward the hallway without a word. And the sound that stays with me, even now, is not a sound at all. It is the absence of one. The particular silence of someone choosing not to speak, because speaking would have cost them everything they had ever known and trusted and built their whole life around. I was 23 years old. I had a duffel bag that held 2 changes of clothes, a folder with some documents I had spent months gathering quietly, and enough cash to last me perhaps 2 weeks if I was careful. I did not yet know how to drive. I had never opened a bank account in my own name. I had never signed a lease, never filed a tax return, never stood in a queue at a government office and been the person at the front of it. And the thing that nobody who has not lived inside a community like mine will fully understand is that none of that was the hardest part. The hardest part was the silence. People on the outside imagine a dramatic confrontation. They imagine raised voices and tearful goodbyes and someone calling after you down the driveway. What actually happens is quieter than anything you have heard in your life. And somehow, that is the part that takes the longest to recover from. My name is Nora. This channel is called Nora Outside the Meeting, and it exists because I spent the first 23 years of my life being told there were things I was not permitted to say out loud, and I have decided that that is no longer going to be true. I grew up inside a closed Brethren community in regional Victoria, Australia. If you have not heard of the exclusive Brethren, you are not alone in that. We lived quietly, deliberately, apart from the world, in a separateness that was not incidental but doctrinal, bone deep, built into the foundations of everything. I am here now because I believe the truth of what that life is actually like deserves to be said plainly, and because I know there are people watching this who have been carrying their own version of this story alone for far too long. If that is you, please subscribe and like this video and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss what I share here. It genuinely means more to me than I can properly express. Now let me tell you what leaving actually costs, because I have never heard anyone say it plainly enough. I had been planning it for close to 18 months before the morning I finally walked out. That is the part that surprises people most, I think. They imagine it as a single decision, a flash of clarity, a moment of resolve where you simply pick up the bag and go. But it is nothing like that. It is more like carrying a stone in your chest for a year and a half. You hold the thought of leaving, turn it over, set it down, pick it up again. You lie awake at 2 a.m. asking yourself whether the questions forming in your mind are a sign of spiritual failure or evidence of something honest trying to surface. You sit in the meeting on a Sunday morning with your head bowed and you think, do I still believe this? And the question itself feels like a kind of betrayal, which makes it harder to look at directly, which means it grows in the dark where you are not looking. I had been received into fellowship at 19. That is the line. Inside the Brethren. That is the moment everything changes. Before that, if you leave, if you drift, if you simply stop coming, it is painful. People are concerned. Your family grieves. But the formal consequences are limited. You are a lost sheep. The shepherd is still looking. You can still eat at your parents' table. You are someone who has wandered but might yet come back. After you are received into fellowship, the rules change in ways that are hard to overstate. When you are received, you make a commitment before God and the entire assembly. You are breaking bread with them, which for the brethren is the most sacred act of unity available. You are saying, with your whole body and your presence and the structure of your daily life, that you belong to this community, that you belong to this separation from the world, that you accept this understanding of what faithfulness requires. And when you leave after that, When you choose to go and not return, the community has a name for what follows: withdrawal. I had known about withdrawal my whole life. The way you know about certain kinds of weather, you do not think about it every day, but it is always there in the sky. Withdrawal is the formal act by which the assembly separates itself from someone who has broken fellowship. Once someone is withdrawn from, members of the community cannot eat at the same table as them. They cannot travel with them. They cannot conduct business with them. They are instructed to treat the withdrawn from person as someone of the world, which, in the brethren understanding, means someone you love and pray for from a distance, someone who exists on the other side of a wall that the community itself did not build and is therefore not permitted to take down. It is not designed to be cruel. I want to say that clearly. From inside the theology, it is understood as an act of love, a serious one. It is meant to make the consequence of leaving so present and so real that the person returns. It is correction. It is meant to hurt in the specific way that brings someone home. What nobody tells you is how precisely it works in the actual texture of daily life. My father could not eat at the same table as me if other members were present. My mother could not accept anything passed from my hand, a cup of tea, a bag of shopping, anything at all. Without it constituting a kind of fellowship she was no longer permitted to share with me. My older brother, who was already well established in the assembly by the time I left, went very quiet and very careful in a way that I understood was its own kind of cost for him. My younger sister, Beth, who had not yet been received into fellowship, was not formally bound by the rules of withdrawal, but the social pressure on her was enormous. She understood, without anyone needing to explain it directly, that to show warmth toward me in public was to put her own standing at risk. So she learned to look through me, not with anger, with something much emptier than anger, the particular blankness of a person trying very hard not to feel what they already feel. The morning I left, no one knew. I had made arrangements through a woman I had met the previous year during a brief period when I was permitted to help at a community garden project on the outskirts of town, one of the few contexts in which I had been able to build a real connection with someone outside the meeting. Her name was Margaret. She was in her mid-50s, quietly competent, and not in the least bit interested in making me feel either rescued or pitied. When I finally told her in fragments over several weeks what I was thinking about doing, she did not press me for a decision. She said, "If and when you are ready, call me from the phone box at the end of your road, and I will be there within the hour." She said it the way you say something you have said before and mean completely. I woke at 5 on the morning I left. This was not unusual. Our household was early rising without exception. I dressed in the kitchen before the others were properly awake. I put the kettle on, which was not unusual. I moved through that kitchen in the low gray light of a Victorian winter morning, doing everything exactly as I had always done, and the pain of the ordinary was something I had not anticipated and was entirely unprepared for. The feel of the linoleum under my feet, the particular sound of the kettle heating on the stove, the smell of that kitchen, something flowery and clean and wooden, a smell I cannot adequately describe to you because it belongs to a place I will never fully return to, and it has no name outside of itself. I stood at that bench, and I made myself pay attention in the way you pay attention to something you are choosing to leave behind. I had written a letter. I had written it 11 or 12 times across the preceding months, in the back of a notebook I kept tucked inside a box of winter clothes at the top of the wardrobe. In the end, the letter said almost nothing. It said that I loved them, which was entirely true. It said that I was sorry for the pain this would cause, which was also true. It said that the questions in my mind had grown too large to contain inside the life I was living, and that I did not expect them to understand this, but hoped, in time, something between us might still be possible. I folded it and left it on the kitchen table, where it would be found within the hour. Then I picked up my bag. I walked to the door, and my mother was standing there. She must have heard me moving earlier than usual. She was in the doorway to the hallway in her dressing gown, her hair down around her shoulders. And that detail has never left me, because in 23 years I had almost never seen my mother with her hair down. She was so consistently put together, so consistently composed in the way that community life required, that to see her standing there unprepared, half awake, her hair loose around her face, was to see for just a moment someone I had never quite met, a woman before she became anyone's anything. We looked at each other across the length of the kitchen. I think I said "Mum." I am fairly certain that single syllable is what came out of me. And she held my gaze for a long moment, long enough that something in me started to think. She's going to speak. She's going to cross the floor and take hold of my arm and say something that changes what happens next. And then she smoothed the front of her dressing gown with both hands, the way she always did when composing herself, and she turned around and walked back down the hall. And the sound her bedroom door made as it clicked shut was so quiet, it was almost nothing. Almost nothing. And somehow, at the same time, everything. That was the last real exchange we had for 4 years. I want to stop here and say something I feel strongly about, because this is the place where stories like mine can go badly wrong. My mother is not a villain. Please hold on to that. She is one of the most capable, most faithful, most genuinely loving people I have ever been close to. The precision of her care, the steadiness with which she showed up for people, the particular way she had of making everyone around her feel seen and provided for. I have not met many people like her in the years since I left. What she did that morning was not hatred dressed up as religion. It was the only response her entire world had prepared her to give. To have crossed that kitchen and put her arms around me would have been to defy her assembly, her elders, her understanding of what Scripture required, and 40 years of a life built entirely inside that understanding. I am not asking you to see her as anything other than what she is, a person who was also paying an enormous price that morning, because I believe she was. I believe that closed door cost her more than I will ever fully know. If you are watching this and something in what I just said is opening a feeling in you, if you know what it is to have love and obedience so braided together inside one life that you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins, please subscribe and like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear that the cost of leaving is real, and so is what you find when you get to the other side of it. You should not have to carry this alone. The world outside the meeting had absolutely no idea what to do with me. I use that word, world, deliberately, because that is how I thought of it then, an undifferentiated mass of everything outside. I had a year 10 education at best, because our community's approach to formal schooling was deliberately limited. The outside world was a spiritual hazard, and the goal of our children's education was adequacy and faithfulness, not ambition or inquiry. I had never opened a bank account. I had never filed a tax return. I had never rented anything or signed a lease. I did not have a driver's license. I had only acquired a mobile phone at 22, and I had needed to keep that hidden. What I did have, I could grow food with a high success rate and preserve it for winter. I could manage a household budget down to the last few cents. I could navigate conflict between people without escalation. I could read a room. I knew how to be still and how to wait and how to produce a great deal of work with very little fuss. And precisely none of that had a line on a resume. Margaret drove me to an organization in the city the day after I left because I could not yet drive and did not know the roads. I sat in a small office across from a woman named Helen, who was perhaps 60, and who had the particular quality some people have of making a room feel slower than the world outside it. She asked me what I needed, and I could not answer because I had spent 23 years inside a community that was very precise about what I was supposed to need, and now that I was outside it, the question felt formless. I did not know how to locate myself inside it. What I finally said, after a silence that went on long enough that I became aware of a clock somewhere in the room, was, "I need someone to explain to me what I have missed." What I meant was that my picture of the world was patchwork and uneven. I had absorbed things from the margins. From library books I finished faster than anyone realized during permitted visits. From conversations with outsiders at the garden project, from fragments of radio I was not meant to hear. But the gaps in that picture were invisible to me. I did not know what I did not know. I did not know the shape of my own ignorance. And that, not knowing which things you do not know, was the most disorienting thing of all. Helen connected me, eventually, to a therapist. It took some months because there was a great deal of practical ground to cover first. My schooling equivalency, a bank account, getting onto Medicare, all the infrastructure of an ordinary life, which is not ordinary at all when you are building it from scratch at 23 with no prior framework for any of it. But when I did start seeing someone regularly, she introduced me to a phrase I had never encountered: ambiguous loss. She described it as a specific category of grief, distinct from the grief of death, harder in some ways to process because the people you are grieving are still alive, still present in the world, still breathing, in some cases only a few hours' drive away, still moving through the same rooms I had grown up in. You are mourning people who are setting the table every evening with the same number of chairs and reaching for the same kettle. And there is no funeral. There is no socially sanctioned mourning period, no acknowledged form for the grief. People who know you have left congratulate you on your freedom, and underneath every congratulation is a grief that has no name anyone else can see. She said something else I come back to often. She said that people experiencing ambiguous loss frequently describe feeling unreal, as though they have not fully arrived in the new life, because some essential part of them is still waiting at the door they walked out of. That was the most accurate description I had been given of what those first 2 years felt like. Not exactly unhappy, not exactly present, standing between two realities and belonging entirely to neither. My father wrote to me once in the first year. The letter was 3 sentences long. He said he prayed for me every day, which I believed then and believe still. He said he hoped I would come to my senses before it was too late, which I understood was love in the only language available to him. He said the door was always open if I came back rightly. I read that letter until the paper went soft at the folds. I still have it in the same folder I left home with. My sister Beth found a way to reach me. She was 16 when I left, and because she had not yet been received into fellowship, she was not formally bound by withdrawal. But she understood the risks, and she was careful. For close to 2 years, she passed me messages through Helen's organization. Small things, nothing that could have caused trouble on its own, but everything in aggregate. The family's old dog had finally died after a very long life. There had been a flood through the lower paddock, and some fencing was lost. She had a friend she was spending a lot of time with. Ordinary life, offered to me through a channel so narrow I had to hold still to receive it. It meant more than I can tell you. When my parents found out, the messages stopped. Beth was not formally withdrawn from. She had not broken any covenant, and there was nothing official to act on. But the weight that descended on her was real. She was spoken to. She was watched more carefully. She was made to feel in the accumulated pressure of small moments and quiet conversations exactly what the cost of maintaining contact with me would be over time. And contact stopped. I understood why it stopped, and I understood that she had been protecting what she could for as long as she could, and that the stopping was not a choice she was entirely free to make. I understood all of that. And it still broke something in me that is not finished healing. If you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, if you know what it is to be loved and inaccessible to the same people at exactly the same time, I want you to know that this channel exists for exactly that reason. Subscribe and tap the bell, because the next thing I share might be the one that makes you feel a little less alone in it. The practical rebuilding took longer and required more of me than I had expected. I completed my schooling equivalency at 24. I got a driver's license the year after that, which was its own entire experience. I learned to use the systems that everyone around me had been navigating since their teenage years, and I learned them quietly, without advertising how much ground I was still covering, because the performance of competence is something you develop quickly when the alternative is being seen as someone to be pitied. You become skilled at doing something for what is functionally the first time in a way that looks like the third or fourth. That performance is genuinely exhausting in a way that is hard to describe to someone who has not needed it. It sits on top of grief that is also exhausting, and neither one waits politely for the other to finish before demanding something from you. 4 years after I left, my grandmother became seriously ill. She was my mother's mother, and I had been close to her in a way I find it difficult to explain briefly. She was one of the people from my childhood who had felt, without ever saying so explicitly, without ever doing anything that could be pointed to directly, like she saw me, the actual me, underneath the structure and the duty and the performance of belonging. When I was small, she had a way of asking me questions that were not quite the right questions for the community we were in, questions with a little space around them. I had always thought she had quietly let some of the world in through a crack she never showed anyone. I wrote to my mother asking if I could come. I did not expect a response, or I expected a response that said no, gently and with regret. Instead, my mother rang me from the phone at the meeting room. She did not greet me when I picked up. She said, "Come on Wednesday. Come early before the others arrive. Come by yourself." I drove 3 hours. I sat beside my grandmother's bed for perhaps 40 minutes. She had become small in the way that very ill people sometimes do, as though the body is already beginning to let go of its own outline. I held her hand, which felt like something I needed to be careful with, and she looked at me with the clearest eyes, and in the particular direct way she had always had of arriving at a thing without approaching it first, she said, "I always knew you would not be able to stay. I prayed you would find your way through safely." I have not told anyone she said that until right now. My mother was in the house when I left to drive home. She did not come to the door. At the end of the road, I stopped the car and looked back in the rearview mirror at the house standing in the gray afternoon, and I thought, this is the most love and the most impossibility I have ever tried to hold in the same moment. And then I drove. We speak now, my mother and I. Not often, not without careful management of what we enter together. There are whole rooms of my life and hers that we cannot visit in each other's company. My work, my home, the person I share my life with, the choices that make up the days I now live. She does not ask about those things. I do not ask her to. What we have managed to find between us is a narrow channel, safe, limited, carefully maintained, where we can still be mother and daughter without the rest of it pulling everything apart at the seams. It is not what I wanted when I stood in that driveway at 23. It is not nothing. I refuse to call it nothing. Leaving did not cost me a single thing. It cost me layered, compounding, ongoing things that I am still in the middle of counting. It cost me the smell of that kitchen. It cost me the sound of those particular mornings. It cost me the first language of belonging I ever had. It cost me a version of myself I will never fully know. The woman who might have found peace inside that life if she had been built differently, who might have found the questions manageable, who might have stayed at that table her whole life and felt it was enough. I will never know who she was. She is real to me in the particular way that lost possibilities are real, present and inaccessible, present and absent at the same time. But here is what I also need you to hear, because I think it is the most important thing I am going to say. The leaving built something too. It built the life I am living. It built the vocabulary I now have for my own experience, the words for things I had no words for when I left. It built the capacity to sit here in front of you and say, the silence that was called obedience was not the same as peace. The questions in your mind are not sins. The needs you were taught to distrust in yourself are not pride. I know the difference now. Not as an idea I came across, but as something I lived my way into slowly, over years. And that difference is everything. If this story reached something real in you, I would really like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what part stayed with you. Tell me whether you have ever paid a price for choosing your own life, and whether you think it was worth it. And if you want to keep hearing from someone who spent a long time behind a very closed door, and is still, every day, learning what it means to live with it open, subscribe to Nora Outside the Meeting and ring the bell so every new story reaches you. Until next time, the questions that cost you the most are almost always the ones most worth asking.